Thank you, Austin, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the national security state, Harry Truman, George W. Bush, and America's ramparts in the 21st century. Our oceans have ceased to be moats, which automatically protect our ramparts. Flesh and blood now compete unequally with winged steel. War has become an all-consuming juggernaut. If World War III ever unhappily arrives, it will open new laboratories of death, too horrible to contemplate. This from the famously isolationist senator from Grand Rapids, Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg. Senator Vandenberg, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee after World War II, had come to understand that in a post-Pearl Harbor world, he could not return to his antebellum isolationism if the government was to live up to its constitutional mission to ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and secure the blessings of liberty. The new global context demanded an unprecedented degree of American peacetime engagement abroad to fortify our national security at home. So when President Harry Truman looked to solidify American internationalism through membership in the newly framed United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, through the Truman Doctrine to aid free peoples, and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, he found a natural and indispensable ally in Senator Vandenberg of Grand Rapids. 60 years hence, the challenge of national security is even greater today, despite the work that Truman and Vandenberg set in motion. Today, the challenge of managing information alone requires enormous resources. Bradley Patterson, who served 3 presidents in the White House, wrote in 2000, "The departments and agencies of the national security community generate some 500,000 communications each day between Washington and U.S. diplomatic military intelligence posts abroad. Foreign policy, military policy, and domestic security policy, coordinated and informed by the best possible intelligence. These are the vital elements of a national security." And Hans Morgenthau, the author of American Realism in Foreign Policy, first suggested during the Truman years in the White House that strong institutions are indispensable to national security. We inherited a State Department from the Founding Fathers, an institution to manage foreign affairs. As we shall see, thanks to Truman's National Security Act of 1947, passed again with an assist from Vandenberg, and President George W. Bush's Homeland Security Act of 2002. Today, we have executive departments to manage military and domestic security affairs, and we have the necessary deliberative councils to coordinate and at times implement national security policy from the White House. Yet more than 230 years after General George Washington put the first American spies in the field, we still lack an intelligence branch with adequate responsibility and authority to feed the best possible intelligence into the U.S. national security apparatus. Let's start at the beginning of what has come to be called the national security state. How important was national security and the National Security Act of 1947 to Harry Truman? On July 26, 1947, his sister Mary Jane telephoned him to say that Mama, Martha Ellen Truman, had pneumonia and might not make it through the day. Truman ordered his plane made ready, quickly traveled to the airport for departure, and then delayed takeoff for nearly an hour. Why? A few congressional signatures were needed on the National Security Act before Truman could add his signature and make it law before Congress recessed. He didn't want the act delayed any further, so he waited. Finally, the act arrived, Truman signed it, and minutes later he was airborne. But somewhere over Ohio, he dozed off and dreamt that his mother came in to say, "Goodbye, Harry. Be a good boy." While he was still in the air, Truman was informed that his mother had died at 11:30 that morning. In the words of his biographer, David McCullough, for the rest of the flight, Truman sat by the window looking down at the checkerboard landscape, saying nothing. 6 years after the surprise Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor, the National Security Act was intended to provide a comprehensive program for the future security of the United States. Up until that time, institutions involved in national security were at times disorganized and divided. Ferdinand Eberstadt issued a report on behalf of the U.S. Navy in 1945 acknowledging gaps between foreign and military policy, between State Department and military establishments, gaps between strategic planning and its logistical implementation, between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military and civilian agencies, gaps between and within the military services, gaps in information and intelligence, between the executive and legislative branches of our government, between the several departments, and between the government and its people. The Act sought to close these gaps in several ways. First, it established the unwisely named National Military Establishment, NME, enemy, which consisted of the U.S. Army, Navy, and the new Air Force that was also created by the Act. Second, it established a relatively weak cabinet-level Secretary of Defense charged with exercising general direction and authority over enemy. Third, it founded the National Security Council to advise the President with respect to the integration of domestic, foreign, and military policies. Over the years, especially after Nixon and Kissinger, the National Security Council became the nexus for the most powerful cabinet members and advisors to shape foreign policy and respond to international incidents such as the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Kennedy years. When President George W. Bush was considering action in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, the NSC was his deliberative body. Fourth, the Act created the National Security Resources Board to coordinate military and domestic agencies for wartime mobilization. Finally, it created the Central Intelligence Agency and the Office of the Director of Central Intelligence to oversee the CIA and the broader intelligence community. Although the National Security Act raised numerous fears among Americans that Truman and the 80th Congress were creating a garrison state, complete with an American Gestapo, the final work was a considerably watered-down piece of legislation. It was a compromise bill, Johns Hopkins' Charles Stevenson reminds us, between advocates and opponents of a highly centralized military establishment, between supporters of a regularized process for interagency policymaking and defenders of presidential prerogatives, and between an executive branch needing new legal authorities to deal with the post-war world and a Congress determined to maintain its special powers over the armed forces. The struggle for the National Security Act is too long a story to tell here today, but I can't pass up the opportunity to tell part of it. The unification of the military was the toughest item on Truman's national security agenda. It dominated the contentious public debate, took years to resolve, and finally ended when one of unification's greatest opponents revised his position shortly before diving 16 stories to his death from a Bethesda Naval Hospital window. In fact, the debate over unifying the military so dominated the public consciousness that barely a peep was raised over the CIA, NSA, or NSRB. The United States Army and Navy, both older than the Constitution, have been commanded separately since their inception. In wartime, joint planning had often been necessary, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been established for that purpose during World War II. But in Washington, the two had always been administered separately. Now the need for stronger cooperation and coordination between the Army, the Navy, and the newly emerging Air Force was acknowledged on all sides, with President Truman arguing convincingly that a unified Department of National Defense would simplify the budget, create new efficiencies, facilitate coordination, reassert civilian control over the military, an important point, and lead to better research, training, and planning. I have a feeling, Truman told his staff after VJ Day, that if the Army and Navy fought our enemies as hard as they fought each other, this war had have ended earlier. When unification is accomplished, Truman told Congress, we shall have a military establishment far better adapted to carrying out its share of our national program for achieving peace and security. The U.S. Army agreed with Truman's vision of a jointly administered department. The Navy, on the other hand, feared that total unification would jeopardize its Marine Corps and its naval aviation program, and it feared that it would lose out to the Army in a battle for peacetime resources. Navy Secretary James Forrestal opposed unification and proposed instead that the Joint Chiefs of Staff continue joint strategy and planning, and that the National Security Resources Board and the National Security Council be founded to jointly coordinate policy.